In the scorching heat of South Carolina in May of 1865, where the Civil War had just ended and the world was being violently remade, there occurred an event that military records would describe only as an unusual proceeding in the matter of plantation justice. 3 men, a father, his brother, and his son, were forced to walk barefoot across 1,200 acres of cotton fields they had once owned, supervised, and profited from for 3 decades. They walked for 3 days, 72 hours. Their feet tore open on rocks and thorns. The sun burned their skin. Exhaustion broke their bodies. But it was the confessions that truly destroyed them. But this wasn't just a walk. This was a trial. This was education. This was the moment when men who had never experienced the brutality they inflicted were forced to understand it in the most visceral way possible, through their own bleeding feet and broken spirits. The rules were simple. Walk every field, every acre where enslaved people had worked barefoot for 30 years. Walk in the same conditions, no shoes, no shade, no mercy. And every time you complain about the pain, about the heat, about the impossibility of continuing, you must confess. 1 complaint equals 1 truth. 1 cry of suffering equals 1 admission of the suffering you caused. By the time those 3 days ended, the Thornton family had confessed to murders, rapes, family separations, deliberate medical neglect, and cruelty so casual they had almost forgotten committing them. They had collapsed not just from exhaustion, but from the crushing weight of finally understanding what they had done. Some called it justice. Others called it torture. The Union Army captain who investigated called it perhaps the most effective form of restorative punishment I have witnessed, forcing perpetrators to experience precisely what they inflicted, no more and no less. But the question that haunted everyone who participated or witnessed what became known as the March of Truth was this: can you teach empathy through suffering? Can you force someone to understand by making them walk in shoes they never allowed others to wear? Or in this case, by making them walk without shoes, just as they had forced others to do. This is not a story about simple revenge. This is a story about what happens when the powerless suddenly gain power and must decide what justice actually means. It's about whether understanding can be forced, whether suffering teaches, and whether 3 days of pain can ever balance 30 years of inflicting it. This is the story of 3 men who thought they understood their world, and the 3 days that taught them they understood nothing at all. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from and what you think justice should look like when oppressors finally face consequences. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that challenge everything we think we know about punishment, understanding, and the true meaning of walking in someone else's shoes. The Thornton Plantation covered 1,200 acres of South Carolina's finest cotton-growing land, positioned in the fertile region between Charleston and Columbia, where the soil was rich, the growing season long, and fortunes could be built by those willing to exploit both land and people with equal ruthlessness. Charles Thornton had inherited the property in 1835 at the age of 22 and spent the next 30 years expanding it into one of the most profitable operations in the state. By 1865, at 52 years old, he was considered a pillar of South Carolina society. Wealthy, respected, known for running what he called an efficient and well-ordered enterprise. His brother Edward, 4 years younger, served as the plantation's overseer. Where Charles managed from the comfort of his study with ledgers and calculations, Edward enforced order in the fields with his presence and his willingness to use whatever force he deemed necessary. He was a tall man, heavily built, with a face weathered by decades in the sun and a reputation for being firm but fair among other plantation owners. The enslaved people had a different word for him: merciless. Charles's son, William, at 26, represented the 3rd generation of Thornton prosperity. He had been educated in Charleston, read classical literature, played piano, and considered himself a cultured gentleman. He was also casually, carelessly cruel in the way that young men raised with absolute power over others often are. Capable of violence, without even recognizing it as violence, of inflicting suffering while remaining certain of his own fundamental decency. Together, these 3 men presided over 180 enslaved people who worked their fields, maintained their property, and generated the wealth that supported their comfortable lives. But it was their policy on footwear, or rather, the deliberate absence of it, that would eventually become the instrument of their reckoning. Charles Thornton had a philosophy about shoes. He believed, and stated often to visiting plantation owners, that allowing enslaved people to wear shoes in the fields made them soft and prone to laziness. He argued that bare feet toughened the soles, made workers more nimble in navigating the rows of cotton, and saved significant expense that could be better invested elsewhere. The African foot, he would explain with the false authority of someone who has never actually studied anatomy, is naturally tougher than the European foot. They don't need shoes the way we do. In fact, providing shoes would be almost cruel. It would weaken them, make them dependent on comfort they don't require. This philosophy was enforced absolutely. From March through November, when the fields were being worked, no shoes were permitted for field workers. Not for the children as young as 6 who picked cotton. Not for the elderly who worked until they physically couldn't. Not for the pregnant women who labored until the day they gave birth. Nobody. The South Carolina fields were not kind to bare feet. Cotton plants, while soft to pick, grew amid rocky soil full of sharp stones that the Thorntons never bothered to clear. Thorny weeds flourished between the rows. In summer, the earth became so hot it could blister skin. In early spring and late fall, morning frost made the ground painful to walk on. Injuries were constant. Cuts from rocks, infections from thorns, burns from hot soil, frostbite from cold ground. The enslaved people developed thick calluses over time, but the calluses themselves would crack and bleed. Infections were common, sometimes leading to serious complications. And when someone came to the main house complaining of foot pain, requesting medical attention, or even just a day of rest, Charles Thornton had a standard response. If you can walk to complain, you can walk to work. Medical care for foot injuries was virtually non-existent. There was no plantation doctor. The nearest physician was 10 miles away and would only treat white families. Enslaved people had to rely on their own folk remedies and the knowledge of community healers, treating serious wounds with whatever herbs and materials they could find or make. The most tragic case was Dinah. Dinah had been born on the Thornton Plantation in 1827. By 1861, at 34 years old, she was a field worker known for her strength and her quiet dignity. That July, she stepped on a sharp rock that opened a deep cut on the bottom of her left foot. She asked Edward for a day to rest and let it heal. He refused, telling her the cut was superficial and would toughen up with continued use. She worked for 3 more days as the cut became infected. The infection spread rapidly in the heat and dirt of the fields. By the time it was obvious, even to the Thorntons, that something was seriously wrong, gangrene had set in. There was no doctor, no hospital, no proper medical care available. The plantation blacksmith, a man named Isaac, who had some crude knowledge of surgery, was forced to amputate Dinah's foot with tools meant for shoeing horses. She survived the procedure but was left permanently disabled, unable to work the fields. Charles Thornton's response was to reduce her already minimal food rations, arguing that since she couldn't work, she didn't need as much to eat. Dinah was not unique. Over 30 years, dozens of people had suffered serious foot injuries. Some died from infections, others, like Dinah, were permanently disabled. All of them had been told, in various ways, that their suffering was insignificant, that it was their own fault for being weak or clumsy. The real workers pushed through pain without complaint. The irony was that Charles, Edward, and William always wore the finest boots, handcrafted leather, comfortable and protective, replaced annually. They walked the same fields but never felt the rocks or thorns. They supervised from horseback when possible, and when they did walk, their feet remained protected, comfortable, untouched by the reality of the ground beneath them. The enslaved community of the Thornton Plantation had learned to live with this reality. They bound their feet in rags when they could steal cloth. They walked carefully, learning which paths had fewer rocks, which sections of field were easier on damaged soles. They helped each other, the stronger supporting the injured, sharing what little medicine they could make from wild plants. And they remembered. They remembered every cut, every infection, every person who couldn't work because of foot injuries. They remembered Dinah, who now moved through the quarters on a crutch Isaac had made for her, a living reminder of what Charles Thornton's philosophy actually meant. Moses was one of the eldest, 47 years old in 1865. He had been on the Thornton Plantation since childhood, purchased along with his mother in 1823. He had survived 3 decades of barefoot field work, his feet covered in thick scars and permanent calluses. He was the unofficial leader among the enslaved people, the one they came to for advice and guidance. Moses had learned to navigate the system, to protect people when he could, to pick battles carefully. But he had also learned to remember. He kept a mental record of every injustice, every cruelty, every time someone had begged for mercy and been denied. Moses couldn't read or write. That was forbidden. But his memory was flawless. He could recite the names of everyone who had died or been permanently injured on the plantation, could detail the circumstances of each tragedy. Isaiah was younger, 29. born into slavery on the Thornton land. His rage was hotter than Moses's, less controlled. He had watched his father work until a foot infection killed him when Isaiah was 12. He had seen his sister sold away when Charles Thornton needed quick cash. He had personally experienced Edward's casual violence more times than he could count. Isaiah dreamed of freedom, but he also dreamed of revenge. Sarah was 52, one of the plantation's healers. She knew herbs and roots, could treat wounds and fevers with what little she had access to. She had tried to save Dinah's foot, had begged Edward for time and resources, had been ignored. Sarah had lost count of how many feet she'd tried to heal with inadequate tools, how many infections she'd watched spread because proper medicine was denied. These three, along with others, formed the core of the community. They worked, they endured, they survived. And as the Civil War raged around them, as news of battles and emancipation slowly filtered to the plantation, they began to imagine a different future. By spring of 1865, that future was arriving, whether the Thorntons were ready or not. The news reached the Thornton plantation on May 10th, 1865. The war was over. The Confederacy had surrendered. And slavery, the foundation of everything the Thorntons had built, was abolished. Charles Thornton received the news in his study, sitting at the desk where he had calculated rations and profits for 3 decades. His first instinct was disbelief. His second was calculation. His third was flight. He called his brother and son to an emergency meeting that evening. The 3 men sat in the study that had once been the command center of their empire, trying to figure out how to salvage something from the collapse. "We need to leave," Charles said. "Take what we can carry, convert everything possible to gold, and go somewhere we can start over. Texas, maybe, or South America." Edward agreed. "The slaves will stay docile for a few more days. They don't really understand what's happening yet. We can slip away before they organize." William nodded, though he looked shaken. The certainty that had defined his entire life, that some people owned others, that this was natural and right, had just been declared illegal. He didn't know how to process that. They spent the next 3 days preparing, converting property to portable wealth, packing essentials, planning routes. They moved with the assumption that the enslaved people would remain passive, would wait for official orders, would somehow continue to function as property, even though they legally weren't anymore. They were catastrophically wrong. Moses had been watching. He always watched. He noticed the Thorntons' preparations, the late-night meetings, the subtle packing. He understood what was happening. The masters were going to run, taking their wealth and leaving behind only the devastated plantation and the people they'd exploited for decades. On the evening of May 13th, Moses called a meeting in the largest cabin in the quarters. Nearly everyone came, cramming into the space, their faces showing a mixture of hope, fear, and uncertainty. "They're leaving," Moses announced without preamble. "In 2 days, maybe 3. They're going to take everything and run, and if they do, they'll never answer for what they did. They'll just start over somewhere else, tell themselves it wasn't their fault, that they were just following the customs of their time." "Good riddance," someone said. "Let them go. We're free now. We don't need them." "But they need to answer," Isaiah said, his voice hard. "They need to pay for what they did. For my father, for Dinah's foot, for 30 years of this." "Pay how?" Sarah asked. "They have the guns, the dogs. We may be legally free, but they're still dangerous." "There are 180 of us," Moses said quietly, "and 3 of them. If we act together, if we're smart about it, we can stop them. We can make them stay. We can make them answer." The room erupted in debate. Some wanted to let the Thorntons go, seeing freedom as enough. Others wanted violence, immediate retribution. A few urged caution, fearing that any action against white men, even former masters, would bring deadly consequences. Moses let them argue for an hour before speaking again. "I don't want to kill them," he said, and the room quieted. "I want something harder. I want them to understand." "They'll never understand," Isaiah said bitterly. "Maybe not," Moses agreed, "but I want to try, and I have an idea." He explained his plan. It was audacious, dangerous, and profoundly symbolic. They would capture the Thorntons before they could flee. But instead of harming them, instead of executing them or turning them over immediately to authorities, they would do something else. They would make them walk, barefoot, through every field, every acre of the plantation. The same fields where enslaved people had worked barefoot for 30 years. The same rocks, the same thorns, the same burning soil and freezing mornings. And every time the Thorntons complained, every time they cried out in pain, every time they begged for rest, they would have to confess. One complaint, one truth, one cry of suffering, one admission of suffering caused. 3 days, Moses said. 3 days to walk 1,200 acres. They'll feel every rock, every thorn, every burn, and every cut. And they'll tell us everything they did, every crime, every cruelty, every time they could have shown mercy and chose not to. The room was silent as they processed this. And if they refuse? Someone asked. Then we turn them over to the Union Army with a list of their crimes. Let military justice handle them. But I think they'll walk. Because they won't understand what they're agreeing to until it's too late. Sarah spoke up. And what does this give us? Will it heal Dinah's foot? Bring back the dead? Will it make the past 3 decades disappear? No, Moses said honestly. But it will make them understand, really understand. And maybe that's worth something. The vote was close, but it passed. They would capture the Thorntons. They would make them walk. They would force confession through experience. The March of Truth would begin at dawn on May 15th, 1865. The Thorntons planned to leave just before dawn on May 15th, riding out quietly before the enslaved people woke for the day's work. But when Charles, Edward, and William emerged from the main house with bags packed and horses saddled, they found their path blocked. 180 people stood in complete silence, forming a human wall across the road, across the paths, across every possible exit from the property. They weren't armed, weren't threatening violence. They were just standing there, immovable. Moses stepped forward. You're not leaving. Charles tried authority first, his voice sharp. Get out of the way. We have business elsewhere. Your insolence will be... Will be what? Moses interrupted, his voice calm. We're free now. You can't punish us. You can't sell us. You can't do anything except stand there and realize that for the first time in 30 years, we're the ones making decisions. Edward moved toward his horse, reaching for something, perhaps a weapon. Isaiah and 5 other men moved forward quickly, not violently, but firmly, blocking him. Don't, Isaiah said. There are too many of us. Even if you had weapons, even if you tried to fight, you'd lose. So don't be stupid, just listen. William, who had been silent until now, found his voice. What do you want? Money? We can pay you. We don't want your money, Sarah said, stepping forward. We want justice. Then turn us over to the authorities, Charles said, trying to sound reasonable. The Union Army is in Charleston. If you think we've committed crimes, let them investigate. But this, blocking our way, intimidating us, this is kidnapping. This is illegal. Like slavery was legal? Moses asked. Like beating us was legal? Like working people to death was legal? We're done caring about your laws, Master Thornton. Or rather, former Master Thornton. Charles's face reddened. What do you want? We want you to walk, Moses said simply. Walk where? The fields, every acre of this plantation, all 1,200 acres. The same fields where we worked barefoot for 30 years. You'll walk them too. Barefoot. No horses. No breaks except what we give you. And every time you complain, every time you cry out about pain or heat or exhaustion, you'll confess. You'll tell us one true thing about what you did. One complaint, one confession. The 3 Thorntons stared at him, not quite comprehending. This is insane, Charles finally said. This is justice, Moses replied. 3 days. 3 days of walking to answer for 30 years of watching us walk. You do this, you confess everything. And then we turn you over to Union authorities with your own words as testimony. You refuse, and we turn you over anyway, with a list of accusations you can try to deny. Your choice. Edward laughed, a harsh sound. You think you can make us do this? You think... He stopped because Dinah had moved to the front of the crowd. She stood on her one remaining foot, leaning on her crutch, looking at Edward with an expression that wasn't quite hatred, but something colder. You took my foot, she said quietly. You could have given me 1 day to heal. 1 day. Instead, you made me work until the infection reached bone. So yes, we think we can make you walk 3 days. And if we can't make you, if you refuse, then we'll tell the Union Army everything. And we'll tell them you refuse to answer for it. Charles looked around at the crowd, perhaps finally understanding that his world had genuinely ended. These weren't his slaves anymore. They weren't his property. They were people who had spent 30 years accumulating grievances, and now they had power. 3 days, Moses repeated. That's all. Then you're free to go. or to face whatever justice the army imposes. But those 3 days belonged to us. Charles, Edward, and William huddled together, whispering. They could try to fight, but they'd lose. They could refuse, but that meant immediate arrest with accusations they couldn't fully deny. Or they could do this absurd thing, walk some fields barefoot, tell a few lies that sounded like confessions, and then leave. They fundamentally misunderstood what they were agreeing to. They thought it would be uncomfortable, embarrassing perhaps. They didn't realize it would be transformative. Fine, Charles said finally. We'll do your ridiculous march. We'll walk your fields and tell you whatever confessions you want to hear. But after 3 days, this ends. After 3 days, Moses agreed. This ends. One way or another. They had the Thorntons remove their boots. Fine leather boots, handcrafted and comfortable, worn for years without a single blister. The 3 men stood in their stocking feet, looking confused and slightly ridiculous. Socks too, Moses said. That's not neck. Socks too. We didn't have socks, neither do you. Reluctantly, they removed their socks. Their feet were pale, soft, unmarked by labor. The calluses that covered the feet of everyone watching were completely absent. These were feet that had never walked anywhere without protection. One more thing, Moses said. He gestured, and several people brought forward simple clothes, the kind field workers wore. Rough cotton pants, thin shirts, nothing fancy. You want us to change clothes? William asked incredulously. You walk as we walked, barefoot and in field clothes. No gentleman's attire, no reminders of status, just cloth and skin and earth. They changed, there in front of everyone, stripping away their fine clothes and putting on rough worker garments. The transformation was startling. Without their boots and fancy clothes, they looked vulnerable, human, powerless. Moses marked out the road on a rough map, every field, every section of the plantation, starting with the nearest fields and spiraling outward to cover the entire 1,200 acres. Based on his calculations, walking it all would take 3 days if they maintained a steady pace. If they couldn't maintain that pace, it would take longer. We start at dawn tomorrow, Moses announced. Tonight you sleep in the quarters, not the main house. You'll sleep where we slept, eat what we ate, live as we lived. Consider it part of your education. That night, Charles, Edward, and William slept on hardwood pallets sauce in a small cabin. They were given cornmeal mush for dinner, the same meal enslaved people had eaten daily for years. The portions were small, bland, barely filling. William tried to complain about the food and was immediately reminded of the rule. Every complaint must be answered with a confession. He fell silent. They didn't sleep well. The pallets were uncomfortable, the cabin cramped. But more than physical discomfort, there was the psychological weight of the next day approaching. They were beginning to realize, perhaps for the first time, that they had genuinely lost control. Dawn came quickly. May 15th, 1865, the first day of the March of Truth. The sun rose over the Thornton Plantation at 5:47 a.m., painting the cotton fields in golden light that would soon become merciless heat. Moses woke the 3 Thorntons before full dawn, as enslaved people had been awakened for decades. Time to work, he said simply. They emerged from the cabin into the cool morning air. The ground was still damp with dew. 180 people stood waiting, not in anger exactly, but in solemn witness. This was their day, their justice, their truth. Moses stood at the front, holding a rough map. We'll start with the eastern fields. 20 acres of cotton, then the 15 acres of vegetables, then northwest to the Rocky Hill section. I'll set the pace. You'll walk it. No running ahead, no falling too far behind, and remember the rule. Every complaint requires a confession. Charles said tiredly. We remember. Then let's begin. The first steps were almost easy. The ground near the quarters was relatively clear, packed dirt from years of foot traffic. Charles, Edward, and William walked with something resembling confidence, perhaps still believing this would be merely uncomfortable rather than transformative. That confidence lasted approximately 30 minutes. As they entered the actual cotton fields, the terrain changed. The pathways between rows were full of small rocks that had worked their way to the surface over years. The earth was uneven, full of hidden stones and hard clods. Morning dew made everything slippery. William was the first to cry out. He stepped on a sharp rock hidden in soft dirt, the edge cutting into his soft sole. Damn it! Moses stopped the procession. That's a complaint. What's your confession? William looked confused, then angry. What? That wasn't a complaint. It was an expression of pain, Moses said calmly. Pain caused by walking barefoot in fields. Pain we felt daily. Every cry of pain requires a confession. That's the rule you agreed to. William looked at his father, who nodded reluctantly. The younger man sighed. Fine. When I was 18, I pushed a field worker. He fell and broke his arm. I told my father it was an accident. It wasn't. I was angry about something trivial, and I pushed him deliberately. The crowd was silent. This was how it would work. Pain equaled truth. They walked on. The sun rose higher. The South Carolina heat began building. By 8 in the morning, the temperature was already uncomfortable. By 9, it was oppressive. Edward was next. As they crossed through a section of field that hadn't been cleared properly, a thorny vine caught his foot, tearing skin. He yelped and stumbled. Confession, Moses said. Edward's face was red with heat and anger. I don't remember every little thing I did. What do you want me to say? The truth, Dinah said, walking alongside the procession on her crutch. Any truth. Pick one of the many. Edward was quiet for a long moment. Then, I whipped a man to death in 1853. His name was Peter. He'd been accused of stealing food, which he probably had because he was hungry. I meant to stop at 20 lashes. I didn't. I was drunk and angry about something else. He died. We buried him quickly and reported it as heart failure. The confession hung in the air like smoke. Several people in the crowd had tears in their eyes. Peter had been someone's brother, someone's friend. They walked on. By midday, all 3 men were suffering. The sun was directly overhead, no shade in the open fields. Their feet were already blistered, every step painful. Soft souls that had never known real labor were tearing apart on terrain they had forced others to walk daily. Charles stumbled and caught himself, crying out involuntarily. When Moses looked at him expectantly, he waved a hand. I'll confess. Just let me think. They stood in the blazing sun while Charles gathered his thoughts. Finally. I separated 37 families over the years, sold husbands away from wives, children from parents. I did it because it was profitable, because it prevented bonds from forming that might lead to rebellion. I told myself it was business. I knew what it did to them. I saw mothers weeping, children crying. I ignored it because their pain was less important than my profit. Sarah, walking nearby, spoke quietly. 37 families. Do you remember any of their names? Charles hesitated, then shook his head. No. They were just entries in ledgers. But we remember, Sarah said. We remember every single one. The march continued. Every hour brought fresh complaints, fresh confessions. By afternoon, the pattern was established. Cry out in pain, confess a truth. The confessions became more detailed as exhaustion lowered their defenses. William confessed to raping 3 women over the years, believing it was his right. Edward confessed to deliberately denying medical care to people who were sick, watching them die rather than paying for a doctor. Charles confessed to financial manipulations that had enriched him while ensuring enslaved people never had enough. Not just food, but clothing, shelter, basic necessities. Each confession was witnessed by dozens of people. Some nodded in recognition of harms they'd suspected. Others heard for the first time the details of cruelties they'd only glimpsed. All of it was being remembered, recorded in memory since most couldn't write. But memory was enough. By late afternoon, they had covered approximately 1/3 of the plantation. Moses called a halt near a water pump. Drink, he said. You have 5 minutes. The 3 men collapsed near the pump, their feet bleeding, their faces sunburned, their bodies exhausted. They drank desperately from the same metal cup enslaved people had shared for years, not caring about dignity or propriety anymore, just grateful for water. This is insane, William gasped. We can't do this for 2 more days. We'll die. We did it for 30 years, Isaiah said, standing over them. And we had to work while we walked. Pick cotton, haul loads. You're just walking, just understanding. As the sun began to set, they reached a stopping point. Moses had planned for them to sleep in the fields, literally in the fields, on the ground, as workers had sometimes been forced to do during harvest season. They were given cornmeal mush again for dinner. No meat, no vegetables, no flavor, just sustenance. They ate it mechanically, too exhausted to protest. Charles looked at his feet in the fading light. They were torn, bloody, swelling. He had blisters on blisters. Every step tomorrow would be agony. "Why are you doing this?" he asked Moses, who sat nearby. "What does this accomplish?" "Do you understand yet?" Moses replied. "Do you understand what it was like?" "My feet hurt. That's what I understand." "No," Moses said. "You understand that your feet hurt after one day. We did this every day for 30 years, and you never cared. That's what you need to understand, not that it hurts, but that you made it hurt and didn't care, that you had the power to change it and chose not to." Charles was quiet for a long time. Then, what if I do understand? What if I see it now? Can we stop?" Moses shook his head. "You're seeing the beginning of understanding. That's not the same as understanding. One day isn't 30 years. You're not done learning yet." As darkness fell completely, the exhausted Thorntons fell asleep on the hard ground, surrounded by people they had once owned, under stars that looked the same but meant something entirely different now. Day 1 was complete. 2 more days to go. The second day began worse than the first. When Moses woke them before dawn, all 3 men could barely stand. Their feet had stiffened overnight, the cuts and blisters swelling, every movement excruciating. What had been painful the previous day was now nearly unbearable. "I can't," William said flatly, staring at his grotesquely swollen feet. "I physically cannot do this." "Then confess that you can't," Moses said. "But that's still a complaint, which means you still owe a confession." William looked at him with something like hatred. "Haven't we confessed enough? We've told you things we've never told anyone. Isn't that sufficient?" "Sufficient for 1 day," Moses replied. "You have 2 more days to go." They struggled to their feet, every movement bringing fresh waves of pain. The crowd gathered to watch again, their faces showing a complex mixture of satisfaction, discomfort, and grim determination. The second day's route took them through the roughest section of the plantation, the rocky hillside fields where the terrain was so difficult that even young, healthy workers had struggled. Moses had designed the route deliberately, escalating the difficulty as the Thorntons' capacity to endure decreased. Within an hour, they were all crying out regularly. Edward fell twice in the first mile, his exhausted legs unable to navigate the uneven ground. Each fall required a confession. He confessed to burning a man's hands as punishment for breaking a tool. He confessed to setting dogs on people who tried to run. He confessed to taking pleasure in other people's fear, in the power he had over them. Charles, trying to maintain some dignity, was grinding his teeth against the pain, attempting not to cry out. But eventually, biology overwhelmed pride. He collapsed, unable to walk further, weeping from a combination of physical agony and psychological breakdown. "I can't," he sobbed. "I can't do this. Please. Please just kill me if you want revenge. Don't make me do this anymore." Moses knelt beside him. "This isn't revenge. If we wanted revenge, we could do far worse. This is understanding. You're feeling a fraction of what you inflicted, and I need you to understand that. Can you walk more?" "No." "Then rest. 10 minutes. Then we continue." During those 10 minutes, Sarah approached Charles with a mixture of herbs and water. "This will help with the pain," she said, offering it to him. Charles looked at her with confusion. "Why would you help me?" "Because I'm a healer," Sarah said simply. "Because my purpose is to reduce suffering, not increase it. Because unlike you, I understand that mercy isn't weakness." He drank the mixture, and after 10 minutes, managed to stand again. The herbal medicine didn't eliminate the pain, but it dulled it enough to continue. They walked on. By midday, the confessions were coming unprompted. The pain was constant now, and the act of confessing had become almost automatic. Each truth seemed to bring a strange relief, as if speaking it aloud somehow lessened its weight. William confessed to deliberately destroying family bonds, to encouraging division among enslaved people to prevent unity. Charles confessed to financial crimes beyond slavery, cheating business partners, bribing officials, building his fortune through corruption as much as through enslaved labor. Edward's confessions became darker. He described violence in meticulous detail, as if the act of finally speaking truth was breaking through decades of denial. He confessed to murders beyond Peter, to rape, to torture done not even for discipline, but simply because he could. Some of the witnesses turned away. Others wept. Isaiah, walking alongside, felt his rage transforming into something more complex. Not sympathy for the Thorntons, but a disturbing realization about what unchecked power does to people. "You became monsters," Isaiah said to Edward during one rest period. "But were you born monsters? Or did owning people make you into monsters?" Edward, delirious with pain and exhaustion, actually considered the question. "I don't know. I don't remember who I was before I had power over others. That was so long ago. Maybe there was never before." The afternoon brought them to a section of field that held particular significance, the place where Dinah had been working when she stepped on the rock that destroyed her foot. Moses stopped the procession here deliberately. "Dinah," he said, "this is where it happened. Tell them." Dinah moved forward on her crutch, looking at the ground as if she could still see the exact spot. "I was working right here. July sun, hotter than today. I felt the rock cut my foot, felt blood filling my shoe. Oh wait, I wasn't wearing shoes. You didn't allow shoes. I felt blood pooling in the dirt. I walked to the edge of the field and asked the overseer, 'That's you, Edward, if I could rest.' You said no. You said the cut was nothing. You said if I could walk to complain, I could work." She looked directly at Edward, who couldn't meet her eyes. "I worked 3 more days. Each day the pain got worse. By the 4th day, I couldn't put any weight on it. By the 5th day, I had a fever. By the 6th day, the infection was so bad you could smell it. And only then, only when it was too late to save the foot, did anyone acknowledge that maybe I shouldn't have been working." "I'm sorry," Edward whispered. "Are you?" Dinah asked. "Are you sorry for what you did? Or sorry that you have to walk on feet that hurt like mine hurt? Are you sorry you caused suffering? Or sorry you're experiencing it?" Edward didn't answer. They walked until sunset, covering another third of the plantation. By the time Moses called a halt for the night, all 3 Thorntons were in terrible condition. Their feet were worse than the day before, infected cuts, deep blisters, possible stress fractures from walking on swollen tissue. Their sunburns had progressed to serious burns. They were dehydrated despite water breaks, their bodies struggling to cope with heat they'd never had to endure. That night, something shifted in the atmosphere. As they sat around a small fire, eating their meager meal, Charles began speaking without being prompted, without complaint triggering the confession. He simply started talking. "I knew," he said quietly. "I always knew. I told myself stories. That they were suited for this work, that they didn't feel pain the way we did, that this was the natural order of things. But I knew. I saw the blood. I saw the suffering. I saw children crying and mothers grieving. And I chose profit over mercy, every single time." He looked around at the faces watching him in the firelight. "I chose this. I built this system. And I benefited from it while telling myself I was a good man, a Christian, a pillar of society. I went to church and prayed and came home, and calculated how to extract more labor from people I claimed weren't fully human. The hypocrisy was... it was monstrous. I was monstrous." "Yes," Moses said simply. "You were. Can I be anything else now?" Charles asked. "Can a monster become human again?" "I don't know," Moses admitted, "but recognizing you were a monster is the first step." William had been silent most of the evening, but now he spoke. "What happens after 3 days?" "You turn us over to the Union Army. They'll try us. We'll likely be imprisoned or executed. So even if we understand now, even if we're genuinely changed, what does it matter?" "It matters to us," Sarah said. "Whether it matters to you is your problem, not ours." As the night deepened, the exhausted Thorntons slept, their bodies shutting down from the combined physical and emotional trauma. Around them, the formerly enslaved people kept watch, talking quietly about what they were witnessing. Some felt satisfaction, seeing their oppressors broken. Others felt disturbed, wondering if forcing this understanding made them complicit in cruelty themselves. A few felt something like pity, though they suppressed it, knowing that 3 days of suffering couldn't balance 30 years. Moses sat apart from the others, looking at the stars, thinking about justice and revenge and the thin line between them. He had designed this march, believing it would bring understanding, would force the Thorntons to truly comprehend what they had done. And it was working. They were understanding, confessing, breaking down. But what did that understanding accomplish? Would it heal the wounds of the past? Would it restore lost feet, lost lives, lost decades? Or was this just elaborate revenge dressed up in the language of justice? He didn't have answers. He just knew that tomorrow would be the third and final day. And whatever revelation or resolution was coming would arrive then. Day 2 ended with 3 broken men sleeping on hard ground, surrounded by people who had once been their property, but were now their judges, their teachers, their truth-tellers. One more day to go. Dawn of the 3rd day arrived with a misty rain, unusual for May in South Carolina, but perhaps fitting for what was to come. The rain made the ground muddy and treacherous, adding another layer of difficulty to what was already nearly impossible. The 3 Thorntons could barely move. Their feet had deteriorated beyond blisters into open wounds, possibly infected. Every step was agony that made the previous day's pain seem mild by comparison. Their minds were as broken as their bodies. 2 days of physical torture and enforced truth-telling having stripped away all their defenses. Moses looked at them with something approaching concern. They might actually die if pushed further. But the route wasn't complete. The final third of the plantation remained, including the most symbolically important section, the field where multiple people had died over the years from exhaustion, injury, and neglect. "Can you stand?" Moses asked Charles. The older man tried, failed, tried again, and managed to get to his feet through pure force of will. "Barely." "Can you walk?" "I don't know. Doesn't matter. We agreed to 3 days. We'll do 3 days." Edward and William managed to stand as well, though both looked ready to collapse. William was crying, had been crying on and off since yesterday afternoon. Edward's face was completely blank, as if he'd shut down emotionally to survive. "This is the last day," Moses said. "After this, you're done. We'll take you to the Union Army outpost in Charleston. They'll hear your confessions, see your condition, and decide what justice looks like. But this day matters. This day is where people died, and I need you to walk where they died and understand what that means." They began walking. The rain made everything harder. The ground was slippery, visibility was reduced, and the moisture prevented their feet from drying, keeping wounds open and vulnerable to infection. Within the first hour, all 3 had fallen multiple times. Each fall brought automatic confessions now, the pattern so ingrained that they spoke truth without even being prompted. Charles confessed to knowing about sexual abuse of enslaved women and doing nothing. William confessed to causing a child's death by deliberately startling a horse the child was near. Edward confessed to psychological torture, telling people their family members had died when they hadn't, just to see their reactions. The confessions had moved beyond specific incidents into something deeper. They were confessing the mindset, the philosophy, the entire worldview that had allowed them to treat people as property. They were confessing to the core sin, not just its symptoms. Around mid-morning, they reached a small graveyard at the edge of the fields. Unmarked graves, dozens of them, where enslaved people who died on the plantation had been buried. Moses stopped the procession here. "Do you know who's buried here?" he asked. The Thorntons shook their heads. "Neither do we, most of them," Moses said. "You didn't keep records of our dead. Just records of property losses, financial impacts. These are people whose names we don't remember, whose stories are lost. They worked here, they died here, they were buried here. And you profited from every day of their labor without even remembering they existed." Charles sank to his knees in the mud, looking at the unmarked graves. "How many?" "We count 73 graves in 30 years, Sarah said. "But there could be more. We're not sure. You didn't tell us when you buried someone." 73 people, Charles whispered. 73 people died creating my wealth, and I don't remember any of their names." "Now you're beginning to understand," Moses said. "Not just that you caused suffering, but the scale of it. The systematic erasure of humanity. That's what needs to be understood." They walked on, through the graveyard and into the fields beyond. The rain intensified, turning the ground into thick mud that pulled at their already destroyed feet. They were moving slowly now, each step requiring visible effort. Isaiah, who had been silent for most of the march, suddenly spoke. "I want to stop this." Moses turned to him. "Why?" "Because look at them. They're broken. They understand. What more do we gain by pushing them further? Are we just torturing them now for the sake of it?" "They're not done," Moses said. "When are they done?" Isaiah pressed. "When they die?" When they're so destroyed they can't function? Where's the line? It was a question that had been building throughout the march. Where was the line between just punishment and cruelty? When did teaching become torture? Moses didn't have a clear answer. The line is at the end of 3 days, covering the plantation they profited from. That was the agreement. But we're the ones who made that agreement, Isaiah said. We can change it. We can show mercy. Mercy? Several voices spoke at once, some agreeing with Isaiah, others angry at the suggestion. Dinah moved forward on her crutch. Let me say something. The crowd quieted. I lost my foot because Edward showed no mercy. Part of me wants him to walk until his feet fall off, until he understands in his body what I understood in mine. But Isaiah is right about something. We're not them. We can choose differently. She turned to Edward, who was standing nearby, swaying with exhaustion. Do you understand now? Really understand? Edward looked at her, his face a map of pain and realization. Yes. God help me, yes. I see it. I see what I did. I see the person I was, and I'm horrified by him, by me. Do you understand that understanding changes nothing? Dinah asked. My foot doesn't grow back because you feel bad. The dead don't resurrect because you're sorry. I know, Edward said, his voice breaking. I know understanding is inadequate, but it's all I have to offer now. The debate continued for several minutes. The community divided. Some wanted the march completed, seeing the full 3 days as necessary. Others felt enough had been accomplished, and continuing was just cruelty. Finally, Sarah spoke. Let them decide. They've walked 2.5 days. Let them choose. Continue for the rest of the day and complete the march, or stop now and accept whatever judgment we give them. Their choice. Moses looked at the 3 Thorntons. Well? Charles, Edward, and William looked at each other, having a silent conversation. Finally, Charles spoke. We'll finish. Not because we're brave or strong, but because if we stop now, we'll always wonder if we could have completed it. We'll always question if we truly understood. So we'll finish. Whatever it takes. Even if it kills you? Moses asked. Even then, Charles said. That would be fitting justice, wouldn't it? To die in the fields where so many died because of me? So they continued. The final section of the plantation stretched before them. Another 4 hours of walking if they could maintain any pace at all. The rain continued falling, washing blood from their feet, mixing it into the soil of South Carolina, adding their suffering to ground that had absorbed so much suffering already. The confessions continued, but they had changed in character. They were no longer just admissions of specific crimes, but reflections on the entire system, the whole edifice of slavery that had allowed them to become what they became. William confessed. I was taught that owning people was natural. My father taught me, his father taught him. We had religion supporting it, law protecting it, society celebrating it. And I never questioned it, because questioning would have meant admitting my whole world was built on horror. So I chose comfortable blindness over uncomfortable truth. That choice made me a monster, too. The afternoon wore on. They walked through fields where people had collapsed and died. Fields where children had worked despite being too small to reach the cotton bolls, probably. Fields where the earth had been watered with sweat and blood and tears for 3 decades. And as they walked, something strange happened. The confession stopped being just about slavery and became about humanity itself, about how easy it is to dehumanize others, about how power corrupts not dramatically, but gradually, incrementally, until you look back and don't recognize the person you've become. Charles confessed, I thought I was good because I went to church and loved my family and was kind to my friends. But goodness isn't about how you treat equals. It's about how you treat those who can't fight back. And by that measure, I was never good. I was just comfortable. As the sun began setting on the 3rd day, they finally reached the end. The last field. The final steps. They had walked 1,200 acres in 3 days. Their feet were destroyed, their bodies broken, their minds transformed. Moses stood at the boundary marker. This is it. You've completed the march. You've confessed. You've understood, as much as 3 days can force understanding. What happens now is up to the Union Army. The 3 Thorntons collapsed at the boundary, unable to take another step. Around them, the crowd of formerly enslaved people stood in silence, processing what they had just witnessed and participated in. Had it been justice Revenge, education, cruelty, mercy? Perhaps all of those things at once. Sarah moved forward with her herbs and water, beginning to treat their wounds despite everything. "This will hurt," she said. She cleaned the worst of the infections. "Everything hurts," Charles said. "But thank you. For what little that's worth, thank you." As darkness fell, they made camp one final time. Tomorrow, they would go to Charleston, to the Union Army, to whatever legal justice awaited. But tonight, they rested at the end of their march, fundamentally different people than they had been 3 days ago. Whether that difference mattered, whether understanding could ever balance cruelty, whether 3 days could answer for 30 years, those questions remained open. But the march was complete. The truth had been told. And in some small way, that was perhaps inadequate, but perhaps all that was possible. Justice had been served. The morning of May 18th brought clear skies and a strange quiet. The formerly enslaved people of the Thornton Plantation gathered in the main yard, while the 3 Thornton men lay on crude stretchers, barely conscious. Their feet were wrapped in cloth soaked with Sarah's herbal preparations, their faces gaunt from exhaustion and malnutrition. A wagon had been prepared to take them to Charleston, to the Union Army headquarters, where Captain Daniel Reynolds was handling cases related to plantation atrocities. Moses had sent a messenger ahead with documentation, a written account of the march, recorded confessions, witness testimonies from dozens of people. Before they left, Moses called a final gathering. "What we did over these 3 days will be judged by many people," he said to the assembled crowd. "Some will call it justice. Some will call it torture. History will make its own judgment. But I want everyone here to understand something. We chose understanding over death. We chose teaching over execution. We forced them to experience what we experienced, but we didn't become them. That matters." Isaiah stepped forward. "I wanted them dead. 3 days ago, I would have killed all 3 without hesitation. But watching them break, hearing them confess, seeing them understand, I don't know if I'm satisfied or disturbed or both. But I know I'm not the same person I was 3 days ago either. This changed us too." Dinah added, "My foot is still gone. The dead are still dead. But they know now. They understand in their bodies what they did with their power. It's something." As they loaded the Thorntons onto the wagon, Charles managed to speak. "Will you ever forgive us?" The question hung in the air. Finally, Sarah answered. "Forgiveness isn't ours to give. The people you killed can't forgive you. The families you destroyed can't forgive you. We're just the survivors. All we can do is witness what you were and what you became." The wagon rolled toward Charleston, escorted by a group including Moses, Isaiah, and Sarah. They arrived at Union headquarters in the afternoon, where Captain Reynolds received them with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Reynolds was a Massachusetts man in his 30s, educated, idealistic, genuinely committed to justice, but struggling with the messy reality of implementing it. He had handled dozens of cases of plantation cruelty, but this one was unique. He examined the Thornton men, spoke with the witnesses, read the documented confessions, then he called Moses into his private office. "Help me understand what you did," Reynolds said. "You forced them to walk barefoot through the fields they owned and extracted confessions through their suffering. That's not legal procedure. That's vigilante justice at best, torture at worst." "Is it worse than 30 years of slavery?" Moses asked calmly. "That's not the standard," Reynolds replied. "The Confederacy's defeat doesn't mean we abandon law and order. It means we implement actual justice." "Then implement it," Moses said. "Try them for their confessed crimes. We've given you documentation. We've brought you the accused. We've even brought them broken and ready to accept judgment. What more do you want?" Reynolds ran a hand through his hair. "I want to know if what you did was right." "I don't know if it was right," Moses admitted. "I know it was necessary. I know they would never have understood without experiencing it. I know that talking, explaining, pleading, none of that worked for 30 years. So we made them feel it, and now they understand. Isn't that worth something?" The military tribunal began 2 days later. Charles, Edward, and William Thornton were charged with multiple counts of assault, manslaughter, and abuse under the new legal framework that was attempting to impose federal law on the defeated South. The trial was unusual because the accused didn't defend themselves. They confessed everything. They confirmed every accusation. They provided details that the prosecution hadn't even known about. Charles Thornton's testimony was particularly striking. He sat in the witness chair, still barely able to walk, and recounted 30 years of systematic cruelty with devastating honesty. "I knew it was wrong," he said. "Every time I calculated rations to keep people just barely alive, I knew. Every time I refused medical care that could have saved someone, I knew. Every time I separated a family for profit, I knew. But knowing something is wrong and caring that it's wrong are different things. I didn't care until I felt it myself." The judge, a career military man named Colonel Marcus Bradford, listened to days of testimony with increasing discomfort. He was trying to impose legal order on a situation that seemed to transcend normal legal categories. Finally, he called Moses to testify. "Mr. Moses, I don't know your last name." "Just Moses," Moses said. "I never had a last name before. I might choose one now that I'm free to choose." "Very well." "Moses, did you force these men to march?" "Yes." "Did you extract confession through causing them physical pain?" "Yes." "Did you intend to cause them suffering?" Moses thought carefully before answering. "I intended to cause them understanding. The suffering was necessary for that understanding." "That's sophistical," Bradford said, not unkindly. "You're dressing up revenge in philosophical language." "Maybe," Moses admitted. "Or maybe I'm dressing up education in the only language they could understand. They never felt the rocks under their feet. Now they have. They never felt the sun burning skin that couldn't seek shade. Now they have. They never felt hunger and exhaustion and the impossibility of continuing while being forced to continue anyway. Now they have. Did I want them to suffer? Yes. But I wanted them to suffer specifically what they made us suffer, not something random or excessive. Is that revenge or justice?" Bradford was silent for a long moment. Then, "I don't know. I genuinely don't know." The verdict came after a week of testimony. Charles, Edward, and William Thornton were found guilty of multiple charges, but the sentencing was complicated. Bradford addressed the court. "The crimes committed by the accused are well documented, both through witness testimony and their own confessions. Under normal circumstances, I would impose the maximum penalty available. However, the circumstances here are far from normal." He looked at the three men. "You have already experienced a form of punishment that, while legally questionable, has clearly transformed you. You have confessed crimes you would never have otherwise admitted. You have achieved understanding that would never have otherwise occurred. The question before me is whether further punishment serves any purpose beyond satisfying society's desire for retribution." He paused, clearly struggling with the decision. "Therefore, I sentence each of you to 20 years imprisonment, with a possibility of parole after 10 years if you demonstrate continued reformation and work to make whatever amends are possible for crimes that cannot truly be amended. Additionally, all property and assets are to be divided among the formerly enslaved people of your plantation as partial restitution for 30 years of stolen labor." He turned to Moses and the other witnesses. "As for the march you conducted, I cannot officially condone it. It violated every legal principle of due process. However, I also cannot condemn it without being a hypocrite, because it accomplished what our legal system has never accomplished: actual visceral understanding of harm caused. So I will say only this: what you did was outside the law, but it was perhaps necessary because the law had failed you for so long." The trial ended. The Thorntons were taken to prison, and the formerly enslaved people of the plantation returned to South Carolina to begin building new lives. The years that followed scattered the community that had walked together through those 3 days in May 1865. Moses stayed in South Carolina, helping to organize the newly freed people into a cooperative farming community on the divided Thornton lands. He became a local leader, respected for his wisdom and his careful navigation of the complex post-war world. He married, had children, and lived to see his grandchildren born into freedom. In interviews given late in his life, he never disavowed the march, but he grew more nuanced about it. "I don't regret forcing them to understand, but I wonder sometimes if we understood what it would cost us. We saw ourselves as teachers, but watching someone suffer, even someone who deserves it, changes you. It makes you harder. We needed to be hard to survive slavery, but I wonder if we needed to be that hard after it ended." Isaiah, whose anger had driven much of the initial desire for revenge, moved north to Philadelphia, where he became a carpenter and activist. He spoke publicly about his experiences, but struggled with what the march meant. "I wanted them dead," he told an audience in 1875. "I wanted blood." Moses gave us something stranger. He made them understand. And watching them understand was complicated. I felt satisfied and sick at the same time. That's not a feeling I knew existed. Sarah continued her work as a healer, but the 3 days had affected her deeply. She had spent her life trying to reduce suffering, and then had participated in deliberately causing it, even if for purpose. She wrote in a private journal, one of the few formerly enslaved people who learned to write after freedom. I cannot say if what we did was right. I can only say that mercy without understanding means nothing. They had to feel it, but feeling them feel it, that stays with me. Dinah lived another 20 years, always on her crutch, always missing her foot. When asked about Edward's suffering, she said simply, "He walked 3 days on feet that hurt. I've walked 20 years on a foot that doesn't exist, but he knows now. That's something he didn't know before." As for the Thorntons themselves, Charles died in prison in 1872 after 7 years. His health never recovered from the march and its aftermath. Before his death, he wrote extensively about his experiences, creating a remarkable document of transformation. His final letter, written to Moses, said, "I understand now that understanding is inadequate. My knowledge of what I did doesn't undo it. But perhaps my understanding can serve as warning to others who think themselves good while benefiting from others' suffering. Tell your children that comfortable evil is still evil." Edward served his full 20 years and was released in 1885, a broken man. He lived in poverty for another 5 years, occasionally speaking to small groups about his experiences. He died alone in a boarding house, his feet never fully healing from the infections that began during the march. William, the youngest, survived his sentence and was released in 1875. His story is the most controversial. He became an advocate for reconciliation, giving speeches across the country about his transformation. Some saw this as genuine redemption, others saw it as a privileged white man, profiting from a story of his own cruelty and subsequent enlightenment. He published a memoir in 1880 titled The March of Understanding that sold moderately well and generated fierce debate. Critics argued he was exploiting his victims' suffering. Supporters argued his testimony helped Northern audiences understand the realities of slavery. Moses, when asked, said only, "He understands what he did. Whether he should profit from that understanding is for others to judge." The Thornton Plantation itself became something of a pilgrimage site. The route of the march was informally preserved by the community with markers at significant spots. Visitors would come, both formerly enslaved people and curious Northerners, to walk parts of the route and try to understand what had happened. Interestingly, most visitors who attempted the full route, even with shoes and adequate water, couldn't complete it. The physical and psychological toll was too great. This only reinforced the story's power. If free people couldn't do it with advantages, what did it mean that enslaved people had done it for decades? By the 1890s, academics had begun studying the march as a case study in post-war justice. Papers were written arguing it was justified restorative justice. Other papers condemned it as vigilantism. A few tried to thread the needle, arguing it was both wrong and necessary. Captain Reynolds, the Union Army officer who had overseen the trial, wrote his own account in 1888. "I still don't know if what they did was right. But I know the conventional justice had failed to make the Thorntons understand their crimes. The march accomplished that. Whether the cost, to both perpetrators and victims, was worth the understanding gained, I cannot say. The most significant legacy was philosophical. The March of Truth became a reference point in debates about justice, punishment, and rehabilitation. It asked uncomfortable questions. Can you force empathy through suffering? The Thorntons certainly learned through their feet what they never learned through their minds. But did forced empathy count as real empathy? Could someone who only understood suffering when they experienced it themselves claim to have truly changed? Where's the line between education and torture? Moses framed the march as teaching, but it was teaching through pain. Is that acceptable if the lesson is essential? And who gets to decide what lessons are essential enough to justify suffering? Does understanding absolve guilt? The Thorntons understood what they had done after the march. They genuinely grasped the harm they'd caused. But did that understanding change anything material? Did it restore lost feet, lost lives, lost decades? What does justice for systematic oppression look like? Individual crimes can be punished individually. But how do you address 30 years of systematic dehumanization? How do you balance the scales when the crime is so large it seems unmeasurable? These questions remained unresolved then and remain unresolved now, over 150 years later. In 1920, a memorial was erected on the former Thornton Plantation, now collectively owned and farmed by descendants of those who had been enslaved there. The memorial was simple: a path through the fields with small markers every mile, each inscribed with the name of someone who had died working those fields. The path followed the route of the March of Truth, allowing visitors to walk as the Thorntons had walked, though with shoes. Few completed it. By the 1960s, during the Civil Rights Movement, the March of Truth gained new relevance. Activists referenced it as an example of forcing oppressors to experience what they inflicted. Others warned that it showed the danger of meeting cruelty with cruelty, even justified cruelty. Today, the site is a National Historic Landmark designated in 2010. The Visitor Center presents the story with all its complexity, refusing to simplify it into heroes and villains. Displays include the recorded confessions, testimonies from both sides, and scholarly debates about what it all meant. The most popular exhibit is a recreation of the route. Visitors can walk it with modern shoes, water stations, and the ability to stop whenever they want. The average visitor makes it about 1/4 of the way before giving up, usually saying something like, "I can't believe they did this barefoot," or "How did anyone survive this?" The second most popular exhibit is a wall of questions without answers. Was it justice or revenge? Did forcing understanding through suffering work? What would you have done? Where is the line between punishment and cruelty? Can you teach empathy through pain? Does understanding absolve guilt? Visitors leave responses, creating a constantly evolving conversation about justice, empathy, and the complicated legacy of slavery. Academic discussions continue. Papers are still written. Debates still rage. Some scholars call it restorative justice done right, forcing perpetrators to experience consequences directly. Others call it extra-legal torture that undermines rule of law. Most occupy complicated middle positions, acknowledging elements of both. Perhaps most significantly, the story has become a thought experiment. If you had been there, what would you have done? Would you have made them walk? Would you have stopped it early? Would you have pushed for harsher punishment? Would you have shown mercy? The uncomfortable truth is that most people don't know how they would answer until forced to decide, which is perhaps the point. Justice, the story suggests, is not abstract. It's not theoretical. It's walking 1,200 acres on bleeding feet and confessing your sins with every step. Moses, in his final recorded interview before his death in 1898, said something that echoes across the decades. People ask me if I would do it again. I don't answer because I don't know. What I did know then, and what I know now, is that some people will never understand what they've done until they feel it in their bones. Words bounce off privilege. Pain penetrates it. Was it right? I don't know. Was it necessary? I believe it was. And perhaps that's the only honest answer available. Not certainty about right or wrong, but certainty about necessity. The Thorntons would never have understood without the march. Understanding wouldn't undo what they did, but it was something. In a world where justice for slavery seemed impossible, it was something. The path through the Thornton Plantation remains open to this day. You can walk it if you want. Most people don't finish. But they walk far enough to understand why the march matters, why it haunts us still, why the questions it asks remain unanswered. Because some lessons can only be learned through the feet. If this story left you uncomfortable, good. It should. These are uncomfortable truths about justice, revenge, and the complicated space between them. If it made you question what you believe about punishment and redemption, about whether suffering teaches, about how we balance impossible moral equations, then it did what it was meant to do. The March of Truth happened. 3 men walked 1,200 acres barefoot and confessed 3 decades of cruelty. Whether that was justice or something else, we're still trying to figure out. Share this story with someone ready for difficult questions. Leave a comment with your verdict. Was Moses right to force the march? Would you have done the same? Where would you draw the line? Subscribe for more stories that don't offer easy answers, that challenge our assumptions about right and wrong, that force us to walk in shoes we've never had to wear, or in this case, to walk without shoes we've never had to go without. The path is still there. The questions remain. And somewhere between justice and revenge, between understanding and absolution, between 3 days and 30 years, the truth waits to be walked. The end.